This is Berkeley Talks, a UC Berkeley news podcast from the Office of Communications and Public Affairs that features lectures and conversations at Berkeley. You can follow Berkeley Talks wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're also on YouTube at Berkeley News. New episodes come out every other Friday. You can find all of our podcast episodes with transcripts and photos on UC Berkeley News at news.berkeley.edu/podcasts.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Ben Hermelin. I'm the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost here at UC Berkeley. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the University of California, Berkeley, Berkeley's Department of Economics, and the Division of Social Sciences to the 2025 UC Berkeley Stone Center for Wealth and Income Inequality Annual Lecture. Since 2019, the UC Berkeley Stone Center for Wealth and Income Inequality has served as a campus hub for research, teaching, and data curation concerning the causes, nature, and consequences of wealth and income inequalities, with a special emphasis on the concentration of wealth at the very top. Supported by the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Foundation, as part of a global network of centers, the UC Berkeley Stone Center has been instrumental in advancing this important work on campus and beyond. The center is housed in the UC Berkeley Department of Economics, one of the very top departments in the world, indeed currently tied with 4 others for the #1 ranking in US News and World Report. Beyond the department, the center works in concert with the broader Division of Social Sciences on a number of research projects, including the World Income Inequality Database and the World Inequality Report. The work that the center does is always of importance, perhaps no more so than in the current moment, as our country, and indeed the world, struggles with the political and economic consequences of what many refer to as the second Gilded Age. And now, to introduce our speaker, please welcome my colleague, the Faculty Director of the Stone Center, Professor Emmanuel Saez.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We've packed the room to hear Gabriel Zucman give the annual Stone Lecture on the billionaire tax. So Gabriel Zucman got his PhD in 2013 at the Paris School of Economics. Then we had the good fortune of having him as a faculty here in Berkeley for about 10 years, and he's now been back to Paris, but he continues, his link with UC Berkeley and likes to spend the summer managing, in particular, our summer school on inequality that starts this week. So Gabriel's research has been about accumulation, distribution, and taxation of global wealth. So his academic influence has just been enormous in the sense that he's been able, through very careful measurement, to uncover new striking facts that are very important to understand the development of our societies, eschewing models and really focusing on measurement. So his work has received numerous awards. So let me just mention one, the Clark Medal of the American Economic Association for the best economist under 40, second only to the Nobel Prize in economics. So just wait and see. This one will eventually come. And there are 2 more things I want to mention besides the research. One is the organization of research. So he was the first director of the Stone Center that I now direct, and thanks, to the generosity of Jim and Kathy Stone, we are able, to deploy a lot more funds to study those issues of top wealth and how to address those social issues. In Europe, in Paris, is founded the EU Tax Observatory that plays a very big role in uncovering inequity issues, in the tax system in Europe. It makes a lot of noise, perhaps even too much for the EU Parliament, who decided to fund it. And last thing is what you'll hear about today, the policy implications of the work. What has amazed me about Gabriel is that he's not just about documenting the trend, the inexorable rise of wealth concentration in the US and in other countries, but it is also about bending the curve, thinking about policies, that can change the direction of the curve. So I welcome, Gabriel Zucman to tell us about it today. Thank you.
Thanks a million. Thanks to all of you for being present today. Thanks, Emmanuel, Ben, thanks a lot. Really a great pleasure to tell you about this work on the billionaire tax, a modest proposal for the 21st century. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and to the questions after this short presentation. The starting point is simple. The starting point is that progressive taxation is a key pillar of modern democracies. Indeed, a progressive tax system is important for at least three things. Number one, it is essential to strengthen social cohesion and trust in governments. It's very difficult to trust governments that take structurally more money from the poor than from the rich. And we know that social trust and trust in government in particular is really a key engine, in fact, of economic development and economic growth. And number two, a progressive tax system is essential just in terms of money, generating revenue to fund education, healthcare, public infrastructure, which again are at the core of the rise of productivity over the last century. And number three, and perhaps most importantly, a progressive tax system, and this is something that has been understood for a long time in a country like the US, even though it's been forgotten a little bit, but it's essential to keep wealth concentration in check. Here, the idea is very simple. The idea is that wealth is power, and so an extreme concentration of wealth means an extreme concentration of power, the power to influence policy, politics, the prevailing ideology, the power to buy competitors, and so on and so on. And the most effective tool to keep wealth concentration in check is with a progressive tax system, because it kind of targets all the forms of wealth accumulation that you can think of. Okay, so fundamentally, it's been understood for centuries, for millennia. Plato talked about this, many centuries ago, that there is a tension between extreme wealth and democracy. All right, so what do we know and what's the problem today? So the problem today, I think, is summarized in that chart, which is very simple. And actually, it all starts with work that we conducted about 5-6 years ago with Emmanuel Saez. So that's the black line here, showing how much tax the different groups of the population pay relative to their income. So it's an attempt at measuring the progressivity or the lack of progressivity of our tax systems. If you take the most comprehensive view possible, meaning you include all taxes paid at all levels of government, federal, state, local, and so on, and you allocate all those taxes to individuals, and you divide that by their income. Okay, so on the x-axis, you have the different groups of the population. P010 is the 10% of adult individuals with the lowest income. P1020 is the next decile. And then you can see on the right part of the x-axis, there is a zoom all the way up to the super top. That was kind of the innovation of that work, trying to go all the way up to billionaires. And so what we found a few years ago in the case of the US is, kind of the US tax system that many people view as highly progressive because they have in mind the individual income tax, which to some extent, although you'll see that's not really true, but to some extent is progressive. Overall, the US tax system looks more like a big flat tax, where the effective tax rate, which is shown on the y-axis, is pretty much the same, around 25, 30% for the different groups of the population, with a slight dip, at the very top, with billionaires having, relatively low tax rate. In any case, not higher than the people just below them, or not higher than the middle class. So that's what we found, and it created a bit of noise, but more importantly, it kind of caught fire in the sense that it inspired a number of researchers in other countries to try to do the same thing and to measure the progressivity of the tax system using similar methods, and often even better data than what we could have in the US, in countries like the Netherlands, in Italy, in France. And now there's ongoing work in Brazil, in Sweden, in Norway, like really all over the world. And what those researchers found is what's shown here for 3 European countries, which is essentially in Europe, the level of taxation is higher than in the US. That's no big surprise. And so if you look at what the working class pays, let's say the bottom 50% of the distribution, or what the middle class pays, that's much more than in the US. And these are high levels of taxation, around 40, 50% in a country like France. But everywhere you have this collapse at the very top, with billionaires having particularly low effective tax rates. Okay, so that's kind of the picture that's emerging from this international collaborative research effort, that our tax systems today do not do a good job at taxing the wealthiest individuals in society. And where is that coming from? So what's the problem? The problem is that billionaires have a relatively low tax rate because they pay relatively little income tax. Now, I should clarify, it's very important, and I should have said it, that those graphs include everything. So meaning, for instance, they include VAT in a country like France, sales taxes in the US, corporate taxes, and so on and so on. So the individual income tax is just one tax, but in principle, it's a very important one. It's supposed to be the pillar of tax progressivity. It's supposed to offset at least the regressivity of indirect taxes like VAT or sales taxes. But what we found is that even though it plays an important role, it fails to tax the super rich. And that's due to a number of reasons. And let me first kind of perhaps mention that we had a feeling, people had a feeling that there was a problem. So for instance, you've had journalistic investigations of that issue. A few years ago, you had revelations by the US media, ProPublica, on the tax payments of some US billionaires, and that showed very low tax rates paid by people like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. And so there was this feeling that, okay, yes, there's a problem, but the value added of that research is to show that this goes way beyond just anecdotes. It's kind of a reality that we see not only in the US, but throughout the world. So what's the problem? The problem is that when you're extremely wealthy, it's relatively easy to avoid the income tax by structuring your wealth such that this wealth is not going to generate any sizable amount of taxable income, or even sometimes any taxable income. And how do you do that? Well, you do that, number one, you have to understand that for billionaires, the main source of their income and their wealth is just their ownership of big companies. They own and they control big corporations, and so they can just instruct those companies not to distribute any dividend. And they can also avoid realizing capital gains. And so if they do that, they're not going to have a lot of taxable income. And we see some of that in the US. In other countries, in addition to that, you have other tax avoidance opportunities. What people do in Europe is that they use holding companies to avoid the income tax. So the way it works is that instead of owning shares in their businesses directly, they put a kind of intermediate structure, a kind of shell company to some extent, between themselves and their wealth, And so the holding company receives dividends, and because those dividends are paid to a company and not to a person, they avoid the individual income tax. Very interesting, a century ago, in the 1930s, the US had a debate about that. In 1932, there was a series of hearings in the Senate where, for instance, someone like J.P. Morgan was heard by the Senate and testified about his tax payments. And he disclosed that he had not paid income tax over the last 2 preceding years. And it caused, a big scandal. And the reason why he paid, and he and other very wealthy people of the time paid so little income tax is precisely because the US billionaires of the time, they did that trick. They used holding companies to avoid the income tax. But then people were outraged and they said, okay, now we are not going to allow that. And the US passed a number of anti-avoidance provisions that make it impossible, essentially in the US, to do the type of tax avoidance through holding companies that wealthy people do in Europe. Okay, so the US kind of fixed some of that problem a century ago, but it's very much still a problem in most of the rest of the world. And the consequence of that is shown on that chart here, which is just the same as the first chart, different groups on the x-axis, effective tax rate on the y-axis, except that here it's just showing the individual income tax. And so the individual income tax is progressive for most of the population in the sense that, as you can see in these 3 countries, the tax rate rises sharply, but only up to a point. After roughly the 95th percentile in the Netherlands, the 99.9th percentile in the US and in France, it starts falling. And in the Netherlands and France, it falls all the way to zero, to almost zero. To summarize, that's what we learned in recent years, that people hate it when I say that, the people involved in France, but that France is a tax haven for billionaires. Meaning if you're a billionaire in France, look at the blue line, essentially you pay no income tax, and same in the Netherlands. What it means is that you take the French billionaires, imagine all of a sudden they were to move all of them to the Cayman Islands, it would make no difference to their tax bill. It would make no difference to the tax revenue collection of France. Same for the Netherlands, same for other countries. The US is not as bad, as you can see. It's not like the US billionaires pay a lot of tax, but it doesn't go all the way down to zero because of these anti-avoidance rules that were introduced in the 1930s. All right, so why do we care about all of that? Probably one of the defining features of the world economy over the last decades has been the enormous rise of global billionaire wealth. And the simplest way to measure that is, and the data of course is imperfect, but the best data source that you have is you take the rankings that are compiled by Forbes magazine since 1987, where they try to track the world billionaires. So today you have about 3,000 billionaires globally, according to them. That corresponds to the top 0.0001% wealthiest households at the global level. So 1 out of 1 million household globally is a billionaire. And if you look at that fraction of the world population back in time, and you divide their wealth by world GDP, then you get the blue curve. So what it means is that in 1987, the wealth of billionaires, in short, amounted to the equivalent of 3% of world GDP. And today, it's about 14% of world GDP. Okay, so another way to put it is that average wealth per adult globally has increased 3.2% a year, average income per adult 1.3% a year, but average wealth for billionaires has grown 7.1% a year on average, net of inflation over this almost 4 decades period of time. And there are many reasons behind that. Globalization has played a role, various tax changes, but the fact that they pay so little, in fact, most of the time zero income tax or nearly zero income tax relative to their economic income has been a powerful contributor. It has a kind, it creates a kind of snowballing effect. If you're very rich, you earn a lot of income because your businesses are very profitable and you have no tax to pay on that income, it kind of snowballs and your wealth is going to grow kind of mechanically much faster than the wealth of everybody else. Okay, let's perhaps zoom in on the case of the US and the very, very top of the wealth distribution. So, forget about billionaires, let's talk about more like centi-billionaires, read the tippy top of the wealth distribution. The 19 richest American households today, so 0.00001% of the wealth distribution, and try to compute their share of wealth, divide their wealth by the total wealth of the US. And you can do that. There was one first estimate in 1913, another one by Fortune magazine in the 1950s, and then the annual estimates by again, the Forbes 400 since 1982, and you get that curve. So Ben talked about a second Gilded Age, but if you look at that chart here, it looks like significantly worse than the first Gilded Age, in fact. The first Gilded Age was, the big fortunes of the time, the Carnegies and Rockefeller and so on. Their wealth added up to about 0.8%, just the four richest families of the time, 0.8% of total wealth in the US. And today, if you take the latest data, it's more like 1.8% of the total wealth of the US. And nothing seems to be able to, so far, to bend that curve. Okay, so what do we do? So that's kind of the basic facts. Now, let's talk a little bit about what's feasible and so the progress that's happening. So I had the pleasure last year to work with the Brazilian government because Brazil had the presidency of the G20. And as president of the G20, they wanted to put some new ideas on the agenda. And so a bit before kind of starting their presidency, they got in touch with me and they said, okay, what should we do? The G20, in fact, has been somewhat effective at pushing ideas for more international tax coordination in the past. The G20 was instrumental, for instance, in the development of the global minimum tax on multinational companies. In 2021, 130 countries agreed on having a common minimum tax of 15% on multinational firms. And so Brazil was like, okay, what do we do next? What should we do? And what I thought what should come next is what we were able to do for multinationals, well, we should be able to do the same for billionaires. So let's think about a globally coordinated minimum tax on billionaires. And so then Brazil commissioned a report that I wrote last year that was published actually just 1 year ago on June 25th of 2024. And the baseline proposal is very easy. It's very simple to understand. You take the global billionaires, those 3,000 families, roughly speaking, and you say that each year, each of them should pay a minimum amount of tax equal to, let's say, 2% of their wealth. So some of them, not very many, but some of them might pay more than 2% today, and so for them nothing would change. But if they pay less, then they should pay the difference to reach 2%. 2% is not a big number. 3,000 people, it's a tiny fraction of the world population, but they own a lot of wealth. That's called wealth concentration, wealth inequality. And because they pay so little today, even that very modest proposal, it's not about abolish billionaires. To be clear, abolish billionaires would be 100%. Sometimes people say, well, that's communism. But no, communism is 100%. Today is like 0.2%, and the proposal is 2%. It's really not communism. And yet, it would generate quite a lot of tax revenue, about nearly $250 billion annually at the global level, which you might say, okay, is that a lot? 250, is that a lot of money? To kind of grasp how big it is, I think the proper comparison is that according to the best estimates that we have, developing countries globally need an additional $500 billion in government revenue each year to face the challenges of climate change. So you can get half of that money with this modest tax on very few individuals. So that's one thing. What difference would it make? Well, another way to understand how modest it is that chart here, which is starting from the current picture of tax regressivity. That's the black line, where if you average the data that we have for several countries, you see that on average billionaires pay about 20-25% of their income in taxes, less than other groups. And with the 2% minimum tax, that's how I picked that rate. It's the rate that essentially ensures that billionaires wouldn't pay less than their secretaries or than middle-class individuals more broadly. Okay, it wouldn't make the tax system progressive, so that's another way in which it is really kind of very modest proposal, and it was designed that way to have legs, in a forum like the G20, where people have to come together from very, very many different perspectives. But that's what it would do. And if you extend the tax to centimillionaires, meaning people who have more than $100 million in wealth, then you would get that flat line here. Okay, so bottom line is that with this minimum tax, you're not soaking the rich, you're not making the tax system progressive, you're just erasing something that's just a bug, very hard to defend. Like people, and that's perfectly legitimate, have very different opinions about what's the proper degree of tax progressivity. It's a complicated question. It's easy to overshoot, to undershoot. But I think the vast majority of the population just cannot accept the idea of a world where the most powerful individuals are allowed structurally to pay less than other groups of the population. Okay, so that's what this proposal would address. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the challenges. And I'm not going to talk a lot about technicalities or anything like that. I'm very happy to discuss during the discussion. I want just to highlight the one significant, most complex problem, which is, of course, what do we do if some countries, and there will be, of course, many of them, decline to join an agreement like that and to implement such a minimum tax. And so what I want to say, number one, is that global participation in such an agreement is ideal, of course, but it's not necessary. Any country on its own or any coalition of countries could choose to implement such a tax unilaterally. To make it work in a unilateral setting, you just need guardrails against tax competition. And so you need two things. The most important one is you need to ensure that people cannot just escape the tax by moving abroad, by moving to a non-participating country. And so there are different ways to do that. So the US is unique, or almost unique, in having taxation based on citizenship, meaning if you're a citizen and you move to the Cayman Islands, well, you still have to pay taxes in the US as if you were still a tax resident in the US, but you don't have, most countries don't do that. Most countries are the opposite extreme and are doing something like, okay, if you've lived all your life in France, for instance, and you became a billionaire in France, and now age 70, you choose to move to the Cayman Islands, then immediately, starting January 1st of next year, France stops taxing you. And that's extreme and absurd, like in the opposite direction. And you could imagine a middle ground where taxes would follow you if you've become rich in France for a number of years, perhaps not until you die, but perhaps for 5, 10, 15 years. And that would significantly reduce the risk of tax-driven mobility of wealthy people to tax havens. And the second thing that I want to discuss now is what about is the very important idea that if a country or a coalition of countries was implementing this standard, this principle of let's have a minimum tax on billionaires, there would be good reasons to also ensure that foreign billionaires, those of non-participating countries, are asked to pay a bit more tax. So how would that work? So the idea here is that there are some forms of extraterritorial taxation that are justified, and more than justified, that are necessary. And in fact, getting back to the international agreement on the minimum tax for multinationals, in that agreement, and the Trump administration hates that, but in that agreement, there is a set of provisions that say that the countries that implement the minimum tax on multinational firms are allowed to tax the multinationals of other countries if they are subject to tax rates of less than 15% in those other countries. And so my idea here is just to say, well, what we agreed to do, even though it's controversial, but what we agreed to do at 130 countries in 2021 for multinationals, again, let's do it for billionaires. And so concretely, I don't know, let's say that a number of countries choose to join that system for billionaires, but not the US. What a country like France would do if it had a minimum tax on billionaires, it could say to someone like Elon Musk, I don't know, just to be concrete, for everybody to understand the way it would work in practice, could say something like that. Okay, look, if you want to, number one, you derive your wealth from owning Tesla, from owning companies, multinational firms, which in turn are very valuable because they sell cars all over the world, including in France. So in effect, some of your wealth originates from France or from all of those countries where Tesla sells cars. And so what those countries could say is if Tesla wants to keep having the right to sell cars, it has to come with a certain number of conditions. And one condition is that if you, Elon Musk, don't pay enough tax in the US, you are below 2%, then we, the countries that uphold this standard, we will collect the difference. We will play the role, essentially, of tax collector of last resort, collecting the taxes that the US would choose not to collect. And, well, you can think of that, kind of the short way to summarize that is, in effect, something like tariffs for billionaires, in the sense that it's conditioning market access to having to pay a minimum amount of tax, but it's a form of tariff that's really extremely targeted on a tiny fraction of the population. And at a higher level, I think this is going to be an extremely important debate, an idea in the coming years. It's the idea of how do we reinvent the rules of globalization? And I think at the core of this reinvention, there has to be this principle that free trade has to be tied to minimum standards on taxation, but also on climate, but also on equal pay, on environment, and so on. And that you cannot just have free trade without kind of being completely silent about those issues. So those questions of tax justice, of climate justice, of equality more broadly have to be put at the center of the international trade agreements of the future. Okay, so the conclusion is simple, is number one, that a minimum tax expressed as a fraction of wealth is the most powerful tool to ensure that the very rich contribute effectively. There are other policies that you might think about, like, people often talk about inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is great, but it comes just once in a long time, and that's not enough. It's also this annual minimum tax on billionaires. It's also a very powerful tool that democracies can mobilize to curb the forces of oligarchy, meaning, okay, if there are some untaxed, super powerful, rich billionaires abroad, we are going to collect the taxes that those other countries choose not to collect. And so by using those targeted extraterritorial measures, that's how democracies can export minimal standards of justice and sustainability. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions. So there's questions, yes.
Do you have an opinion where we should start? No?
Everybody's
All right, who wants to go
welcome to
first?
ask questions.
I'm going to go front to back.
If someone's wealth is in the form of publicly traded companies, it's fairly easy to establish their wealth. But if someone has privately held companies or just wealth in various forms, like art even, it's not a clear valuation. I just wondered what process you would have for being fairly valuing wealth.
Okay, that's a very important question. So you're absolutely right that wealth in publicly listed companies is a big component of billionaire wealth. So the numbers are the following. At the global level, about a half of the wealth of global billionaires corresponds to stakes in publicly listed firms, for which there is by definition, no valuation issue. And that's true also for the US, by the way. The other half, sometimes people are like, what about the yachts and the Picassos and look, those things exist, but quantitatively they don't account for a big fraction of the wealth of billionaires. Most of the other half is stakes in private companies. Now, by definition, because we're talking about billionaires, these are going to be big private companies. And we know how to value big private companies. That's what thousands of financial analysts do all the time. Number one, you look at how similar publicly listed firms are valued by the stock market, firms in the same sector with the same profitability, and you apply those valuation multiples to private companies. And number two, for once we have to give credit to the private equity industry. With private equity, you have more and more transactions in private businesses, in large private businesses. And those transactions, every time there's a transaction of private shares, that puts a value on the firm. And so what you could do, this is something we had proposed in our book with Emmanuel, The Triumph of Injustice in 2019, is that those transactions could be made reportable to the IRS or to the tax authority, which would then use those transactions to value the private businesses. At a high level, what's most important to understand is that for such a tax to work, it has to be pre-populated by the tax administration. The tax administration has to send a form to the super rich saying, look, based on the information we get, including from those private share transactions, based on the standard valuation methods that we use, we think your wealth is X. And then the taxpayers, they can try to protest, they can try to say, no, I'm much poorer than that. But then the tax administration could say, well, okay, if you think you're much poorer, then we're going to ask you to pay the tax with shares of your company. Okay, so that if you undervalue, the government, it's going to be neutral, for the government. The government gets shares that it can then resell to the highest bidder. So it's a very important point, but what I want to say, the spirit of my answer is that this is a technical problem that has actual economic solutions.
Just a follow-up to that. First of all, I agree with the problem. I agree we need a solution. I'm not entirely convinced, first of all, putting the politics of this aside for the moment, of getting this this gentleman raised exactly the question I'm going to have. You've got to figure out a way to identify these people and value their assets. I agree there are methodologies for doing it. I'm not sure what the administrative burden of that is going to be. Pretty big, I think, if you identify. But again, those are just issues that would have to be dealt with. What I think you end up with is someone saying this is no longer an income, this is not an income, this is a confiscatory tax. This is taking a percentage of people's assets, a place we've never been. And I'm not sure how many European countries have been there. So it's interesting, never going to happen in this administration, let's be clear. But I mean, that's
Give you
really, that's, yeah, and I'm sure you did. But I'm sure that's right. But just, I want to point out, it looks, that's what it's going to get labeled, is confiscatory. Is not progressive income tax, but confiscatory. And I think there's a big, just a comment, huge burden of getting that through our experience with taxation, as much as I think this is a problem that needs a solution.
No, absolutely. And to your point, it is how it's labeled, not only in the US, but in other countries, very much including France. In fact, one thing I forgot to mention, but that's quite interesting, is that the French National Assembly in February voted a bill to create this tax, exactly that one, minimum tax of 2% on people with more than 100 million euros in net wealth. So it passed the National Assembly, then it was voted down by the Senate in June, just like last week. And it's going to come back. Now it's really a prominent proposal in the public debate in France, so it will come back in the fall and next year and so on. And the opponents of the tax in France, they say exactly this. They say it's confiscatory 2%. So how to answer that? I think number one is you have to compare the 2% to the 7% here. So the wealth of billionaires over 4 decades on average per year, net of inflation, has been growing 7% a year. So with 2%, everything else equal, their wealth would have grown by 5% a year, which would still be much more than the 3% growth rate for the average person globally. So what this means is that with a 2% minimum tax, you are not reducing wealth concentration. You are not stabilizing wealth concentration. You're just slightly reducing the pace of the increase in wealth concentration. So that's one sense in which it's very, very modest. Now, of course, 7% is an average, and some people are going to have rates of returns that are less than 7%. Some, not many of them, but in some cases you can imagine people, having a bad year, having no income, or people creating startups, for instance, and they are not yet profitable, so they have zero income, but a lot of wealth. And so in that case, what the tax would do is essentially those individuals who don't have income, they could pay the tax in kind, with shares of the company. And so it's a very, very modest and gradual kind of socialization, indeed, of wealth, but at a rate of 2% per year. So it's very, very modest, very limited. I think it's important in all these debates on wealth taxation to keep in mind that there is a big wealth tax for most people, which is the property tax. For the middle class, housing is virtually 100% of their wealth, or a big fraction of their wealth. And it's taxed at rates of 1%, sometimes more than 1% in many states in the US, in many countries. And so, why is it okay to have this tax for the middle class and to have nothing for billionaires? There's an inconsistency here, I would say. But bottom line is that, the deep sense in which this is not a confiscation is that if you'd had this tax for 4 decades, you would still have this you would still have seen a huge increase in the wealth of billionaires, but perhaps not as dramatic as the blue line, but a big increase nonetheless.
Sorry. But yeah, no, I get it. I spent 45 years in Washington, and I'm not convinced this is going to get passed anytime in the near future.
I'm not holding my breath for the tax to become a reality in the US anytime soon.
I have some agreement with you. And mine is that when it comes to taxation, complexity is the enemy of the good. And one of the problems with the US tax system, and probably some of the other countries, though I'm not familiar with them, is that complexity favors the upper end of the income scale because they have the ability to hire experts in finding how to keep their rates as low as possible. And I've always wondered about the myth of the marginal rate, because I don't care what a marginal rate is. All I care about are net rates. And I'm wondering if we wouldn't be better served, rather than adding one more kind of tax that strikes me as somewhat complex, is just having revenue taxes, no deductions. I know people love deductions, but I think that every deduction has embedded in it a problem. So my question is, wouldn't looking at the system systemically, and one, eliminating the problem of complexity, and the other, if your tax system is more transparent, you might have a 0 rate, a 5% rate, a 10% rate, and a 25% rate or something like that. I kind of like the VAT tax also, but that's just me. That it would make the system far better than trying to figure out these ways of taxing people who don't pay taxes because the system doesn't do it on its own.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, complexity is a problem. Having simple rules, I think, is valuable. I think this one is actually quite simple. It's the idea that no matter what you do, we're not going to list the myriad ways that rich people can try to avoid the tax. At the end of the day, at the end of the year, no matter how you've structured things, you have to pay a minimum. You have to pay a minimum. And then I think everybody can agree with that just paying 0, that seems too little if you're a billionaire. So there has to be a floor that's higher than 0. And then the question is, okay, so what should be that floor? What should be that minimum? If you compute the minimum as a % of income, it doesn't work, because the very notion of income is just not well defined for billionaires. They can, they can structure their wealth so that there is no income. So that's what. So revenue for the businesses that they own, that would be the idea. Because what's revenue for a person? Gross income. What I want to say is that, when you say revenue, so you seem to have in mind like gross income before deduction, and that for billionaires, this gross income can be 0. Can be 0. There was in the ProPublica leaks that I mentioned, and there's one year where Jeff Bezos reports like literally 0 income, or just a few $1,000s. As CEO of Amazon, he didn't pay himself a wage. And so gross or net, made no difference. It was just 0 gross, 0 net. That's why for the floor to be binding, it has to be expressed as a fraction of wealth. It's a simple but effective idea. No cash flow. All these notions of flows just don't work.
Sorry, I'm going to interject here. Let's keep the questions and audience going, because we do have online participants, and I want to make sure they're getting that as well. Speaking of online, there's a question from the audience online. How did you decide on 2% tax? Why not a higher tax rate, such as 5%?
I have no problem with higher tax rates, I think.
That was an anonymous question, by the way.
To be very clear, the 2% was chosen to obtain this curve, meaning the blue line, meaning it's the rate that erases the regressivity at the very top end. I think an objective that almost everybody on this planet should agree with, that was chosen for that purpose. If I wanted to design a tax to reduce wealth inequality, let me tell you, the rate will have to be way higher than that.
Let's go right here next.
You've given us examples of bad actors, and certainly we feel it every day. Or is there a country or any countries, more than one country around the world, that where you see hope or is making any sort of progress toward this?
Fair question. I can tell you a little bit about my experience being involved a little bit with the discussions around the G20 and who was in favor and who was pushing back. And there were a number of countries that were really supporting the idea. So Brazil, of course, which kind of put that on the agenda, was a big proponent. But France also was supportive. There is a bit of kind of schizophrenia because when it's discussed at the G20, in Sao Paulo, the French government says it's a great idea, and then when it's the same is discussed in Paris, they say, it's terrible. But at the G20, they were very much in favor. You had other countries like Mexico also in favor, strongly in favor. Outside of the G20, you have countries like Spain, like Chile. After France passed a version of that in February, there was a bill that was introduced in Parliament in Belgium, mimicked on this. There are discussions that are starting in fact, many member states in the European Union. So there is the beginning of a burgeoning initiative here. And the way it could get traction is not through an international agreement, because these things, in the current context, it is not happening. But if you have one or several countries that do it, and they do it well, then it could catch fire. Perhaps a little bit like the VAT, big French export. France was the first country to experiment a VAT in the 1950s, and then all the world's countries except the US. That's why I'm not holding my breath for that one. But other countries, they then a few years after created their own VAT. And so I'm not saying the same is going to happen, but there is a possibility that something like that might happen.
Let's do one more online. The US has had a wealth tax for a long time. It is the property tax, and it is the most burdensome on the middle class. So why is the very concept of a wealth tax controversial?
I endorse this question. I think, what can I say? This is true. The US has had a wealth tax. The US, in fact, has a long experience with wealth taxation that dates back to the 17th century, to the 18th century, when in fact there were in the colonies early forms of wealth taxation that were broader than just taxes on real estate and land, but that were also on financial assets. So-called generalized property taxes were the main source, or one of the main sources of tax revenue for US states before the creation of the income tax at the beginning of the 20th century. So there's a very long tradition. In fact, the US kind of pioneered wealth taxation. It's just that people have forgotten about that history, unfortunately.
Thank you, Professor. Fascinating discussion. So the way that I understand the spirit of this policy proposal is that what we are trying to do is maximize on political feasibility, is how I read this. My question is, if we were to do a different optimization and you were to do a diamond in size, optimal income tax, but for wealth taxes, what would that look like? What do you consider in that model?
We did that computation a few years ago in a piece in the Brookings paper, meaning if you want to if you think about what's the wealth tax rate that maximizes tax revenues, that allows you to reach the top of the Laffer curve. You're all familiar with the Laffer curve. You have tax rates on the x-axis, tax revenues on the y-axis. So there is one tax rate that maximizes tax revenues. Emmanuel has done a lot of work for the income tax, showing that this Laffer rate is high, perhaps 70%, 75%, that ballpark. And for wealth, it seems to, according to the computations that we made, and perhaps you can correct me if I forgot the details, but I think it's around like 10%. You know, that's kind of the wealth tax rate that would maximize tax revenues given the wealth trajectories of billionaires, that you always have two types of billionaires. You have people who are on a strongly rising wealth trajectory, like their wealth grows 30, 40% a year. And you have more mature wealth, you know, like owners of big established businesses, their wealth is growing more slowly. And when you take that into account, you get that the optimal wealth tax rate essentially depends on the average number of years that people have been billionaires, that you can estimate empirically by looking at estimates, again, from Forbes magazine, and that gives you this 10%.
Thank you so much for these brilliant ideas and for bringing them not only into academia, but into the public discussion. It's really, really brilliant. So I have many questions, but I'll just ask you one. The so-called patriotic millionaires in the United States, are you networking with them? Would that help in the political feasibility to bring more of the ultra-wealthy in supporting some of your ideas?
Yes, I know them, and I think they're doing useful work, you know, highlighting that, you know, even some very rich people understand that there is a need for measures like that. Though there's a difference between millionaire and billionaires, and billionaires are much less numerous, and I've not found yet any billionaire to come out publicly and strongly and clearly in favor. And I've been trying to, you know, to look for them, and, you know, not yet. If you know them, please let me know.
Well, thank you, Gabriel. This is very interesting and thought-provoking. And one question I have is, why was this successful in France at the kind of the people's level of government, and will there be a price to pay at the Senate level politically, do you think? What's the sense of that right now? And what are the points that resonated with the French people through their assembly?
Okay, let me tell you about French politics. So, French politics is this. So, in the National Assembly, it passed, even though the left, so all the left parties voted for it, and center, center-right, far-right voted against or abstained. And so the left is only 1/3 of the seats. And so how did it pass? It passed because, and it passed twice, in fact, in the National Assembly, so it was not just a blip. It passed because the members of parliament for the center and the right, even though they say they dislike it, they just don't dare to vote against it. They realize that politically, you know, it's difficult, you know, that to say, I'm against the idea that billionaires should have a minimum amount of tax to pay. I am for the right of billionaires to pay zero if they so wish. Very few elected officials can say such things, and so they prefer just not to vote. And so that's how it passed. And so what it all means is that it just reflects the fact that there is a big democratic pressure from citizens on elected representatives, which comes from the fact that these ideas, and there's been a lot of polling on that, are very, very popular, extremely popular. So we're talking about 75%, 80% of people in favor of such policies. And researchers have done work, you know, polling now, you know, with online surveys. You can do this easily in many countries, and they found that in all countries, it's always the same. And it's very much true in the US. 75%, 80% of voters saying they are in favor of that precise measure. In fact, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to find another concrete economic policy that polls so well. Perhaps the minimum wage would be the one that comes the closest to that. But this is really very, very top of the ranking. And that's the fundamental reason why it passed in the National Assembly. And now the Senate in France, well, is not elected by people. It's elected by mayors and people in regions, but not by the general public, and so they are a bit more insulated from that democratic pressure. However, there's a famous precedent, which is the vote on the income tax. In France, the National Assembly passed the progressive income tax in 1909 after years, decades of debates, and the Senate, which always is and already back then was very conservative, blocked the income tax for 5 years, until 1914, but eventually they voted for it in 1914. And so it seems to me that really the stakes today are somewhat similar to that. Is it going to take 5 years, 3 years, 1 year, 10 years? But eventually, I'm relatively optimistic that something like that will see the light of day.
In the chart that you showed, the differences between countries for different income tax rate, it seems that all the differences converge towards the higher end of the spectrum. And so number one, why is that? And number two, it seems to me that the way we're framing this problem is that we're thinking of billionaires as individuals with just more money, whereas they're structurally different. So they're not just one person with more money, they're structurally qualitatively different than just having more money. So one idea would be to have all these countries, which would address your guardrails too, is to pool their billionaires together and have a pool of billionaires, which would make them independent of their own nationality. And whatever is collected from them will be then distributed to the countries by the amount of contribution of their citizens, or whatever it is. In that way, nobody would have an incentive to move from one place to another for the sake of protecting their assets. If it's all pulled together, that definition of country and nationality and all of that goes away. And this is a big enough pool for governments to have an incentive to share that information. And as that information collection processes and social media and technology go around, we'll be much better able to find out who has what. And then that pool of billionaires becomes an international resource for all countries. So you mentioned that the 250 billion would solve the global warming. So that kind of gives the idea that if you want to solve a global problem, you need a global solution for that as well, not an individual one. And that's exactly like that on the opposite side of it, it seems to me.
Okay, no, that's a very intriguing idea. And indeed, it's connected to something very important that I didn't discuss, which is, okay, assume we had an international agreement to collect that money. Where should the money go? And I didn't talk about that at all. And there are very many different legitimate views on that question. You could say, okay, the tax revenues that's collected from US billionaires should stay in the US, or you could say, and that's where they live and so on. But you could also take the opposite perspective, which would be something like that wealth is, they own multinational companies that operate all over the world, that emit carbon, that contribute to global warming. They have been very successful because they've been able to build on knowledge that has been accumulated by billions of people from all over the world over centuries. And so you could make the case that this money should be redistributed internationally. And there have been proposals like that. So for instance, Esther Duflo has written about this idea of using those 250 billion to fund transfers to the poorest people of poor countries who are the most exposed to climate change. And we know how to do that now with money transfers on cell phones and things like that. So that's a very important debate to have. But pragmatically, before we get to that discussion, we need to collect the money first. That's why I talk about the money collection problem. And to the second part of your question, which is, okay, how do we, and it was also asked by someone else, how do we know who these individuals are? How can we identify billionaires in the first place? What I would say is that, first of all, most of the information already exists because they own shares in big companies, but we need to create extra information. And very concretely, what we should do is this. Currently, there is an international exchange of data on multinational companies. That's been the case since 2016. In those documents, we should just add one piece of information, which is asking companies to identify their beneficial owners, meaning all the shareholders who own, let's say, more than 1% of the stock. Just add that piece of information, and essentially it would allow all countries to track their billionaires.
Thank you for this. I was also going to ask about your proposed tax regime for the extraterritorial billionaires. And I guess my question is, what is your anticipated almost like final stage of this? Do you think that, like, let's say we implement this, are countries incentivized to start taxing their own billionaires? Or is it that we just have the ones that agree to it stay? Like, how does this all play out in the end?
Great question. Great question, because this is indeed what's beautiful in this type of proposals is what kind of dynamic process does this trigger. So now imagine that you have a big enough group of countries that say, we're going to tax our billionaires, but also the billionaires of other countries. Well, those other countries would have incentives to collect the tax themselves. Not collecting the tax means leaving money on the table for other countries to grab. And so they would say, okay, we are going to pick the tax, to collect the tax ourselves. And so that's really neat, because it shows how extraterritorial measures like that can not only curb the race to the bottom with capital taxation, which has been a defining feature of international tax policy over the last decades, but also trigger a race to the top where endogenously countries agree on harmonizing their tax rate to that minimum common standard.
I think maybe let's do one more online. What is the feasibility of a flat rate tax with no allowances for deductions and removing tax shelter concepts?
It's feasible. Whether it's desirable is another question, and whether it would fix the problems that we have. I mean, we had that discussion. The super rich, to simplify, they don't have much or sometimes any income. So whether the income tax is flat or extremely progressive, 90%, even 300%, if your income is just your reported income, it's not tax evasion, it's just that they can legally structure their wealth so that it doesn't generate income, and when they need money to consume, they get a loan or they do other things. No matter what the tax rate on this tiny amount of income is going to make no difference. For the very, very top of the wealth distribution, in the ideal tax system, you need some form of tax based on wealth to complement the income tax. Or to put it differently, the creation of the progressive income tax is perhaps one of the most important economic developments, of modern world history. And it's a revolution that's been extremely effective. It has generated a lot of revenue, essential to build a modern social state. But a bit more than 1 century after the start of that revolution, this revolution remains incomplete. The income tax just fails to effectively tax the super rich. So it needs this complement.
Thanks. Decades ago in the 1950s, I think the marginal tax rate was over 90%. And my question is, it took decades for think tanks, the University of Chicago, Goldwater, Reagan, to reverse the tax landscape from, let's just call it, high tax to low tax. So I'm curious, there's about 3,000 billionaires you've identified. I imagine those 3,000 folks would see your modest proposal as confiscatory, but what about the hundreds of millions of other people who might see this current structure as grossly unfair? But who structurally has their hands and feet in the tax structure? And is the current structure a feature of a pre-existing system or one that has been molded to benefit the 3,000 billionaires that currently exist? And how does that get reformed?
Okay, that's a tough question, but it's a fair question. And so, of course, most of the taxpayers involved, they don't like the tax and they're willing to fight it. And so you might say, well, it's hopeless. What fundamentally should make proponents hopeful is just the simple fact that the history of taxation is full of major reversals and U-turns. So let me mention perhaps, just two or three. So number one is the US. Before 1913, the income tax had been ruled unconstitutional. So there was a big movement in the late 19th century, early 20th century to create a progressive income tax, but the Supreme Court in the late 19th century said, no way, it's unconstitutional. So you might say, game over, it will never happen, except that the income tax was created in 1913. And not only was it created in 1913, but then it became extremely progressive. And there is this famous speech by Franklin Roosevelt in Congress in 1942 when he goes to Congress and he says, look, I think that no American should have an income after paying taxes of more than $25,000 of the time, the equivalent of $2 million today. Hence, I propose the creation of a 100% tax on all income above $25,000. And then the Congress people are like, 100%, that's really a lot. But they agree on 94%, which is, of course, not very far from 100%. And then it remains like that pretty much through the 1950s. And even through the 1970s, the top marginal income tax rate is still 70%, which at the time is the highest top marginal income tax rate among rich countries. And then you have another revolution in a very short period of time. 1980, 70%. 1986, the top marginal income tax rate is cut to 28%, which in 86, 28% was the lowest tax rate of rich countries in just a few years. So this is just to say that change happens, and sometimes it happens pretty fast, and in all directions.
I think we have time for one final question. Does anyone have a good one? I saw this hand first. Is that all right? Oh, okay.
Thanks. Thanks for coming, Professor. Behaviorally, many people's preferences around taxation connects to notions of deservingness and people's productivity. What would be your best argument about the relative productivity of individuals across this spectrum?
I think most people understand that you become on your own, that wealth, at least to some extent, and we can debate, but at least to some extent has to be a social creation. The workers of the companies that you own have built that wealth. The government has contributed to that wealth creation through infrastructure, education, and so on. And so it's just not possible to make the case that you become a billionaire, just like that, and that you should be allowed to pay zero. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for this. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you for the lively discussion. And so I invite everybody to come out and have a drink and continue, this conversation informally. Thank you. Thank you all to the organizers for such a great event. Thank you.
You've been listening to Berkeley Talks, a UC Berkeley News podcast from the Office of Communications and Public Affairs that features lectures and conversations at Berkeley. Follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can find all of our podcast episodes with transcripts and photos on UC Berkeley News at news.berkeley.edu/podcasts.